Hi, and welcome back to Hot Off the Press, the show about new releases and the authors that bring them to you. I'm your host, Jim Nettles, and tonight we're stacked up with a bunch of authors bringing you stuff to add to that to-be-read pile. So let's see who all has joined us with a bunch of familiar faces and what they're bringing in tonight. So, Andy, you're up first.
So I'm Andy Gallo. I've read a lot of stuff, but right now I'm writing paranormal romance, gay paranormal romance, or MMR paranormal romance. Politically correct, walking beat. I've written contemporary. I've written straight mainstream fantasy, no romance. So I think this is actually where I want to stay for.
Nancy?
I'm Nancy Northcott. I write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books, and I also independently publish several subgenres of romance and science fiction adventure that I co-write with Jeannie Adams. And one of the subgenres of romance that I write is paranormal, and I'm here to talk about that tonight.
And Jean Marie.
Hi, I'm Jean Marie Ward. I write fiction, nonfiction, and everything in between. However, tonight I'll be talking about my fantasy work, most particularly Siren Bridge, my comic fantasy western coming from Falstaff Books. May 25th, we actually have a release date. We actually have a cover, and I can show it to you. And to give you a little hint of something else that's coming, I have a story in Dragonesque that will be from Zombies Need Brains, which will be appearing sometime this summer, and I do have a cover for that.
So let's dive in a little bit here and talk about kind of the worlds everybody's going to be stepping into. So Andy, with your love and romance, what are we going to be stepping into here? What's kind of the general setup?
It's an alternative world. It will look very familiar and very different. I specifically chose that to completely becoming God again. I got a little tired of that, trying to create the whole world with complete with romance, deities, kingdoms, all that stuff. So I decided not to do that this time. So it's set basically in mid-Atlantic United States for now, and it is pretty much contemporary times, although it doesn't have a year. There's no, President Biden, President Trump, President Obama. There's none of that in there, so you don't have it doesn't timestamp itself. And in this world, there are essentially three separate different, and there's 3 or 4 different governing bodies. There's the UN, there's the Mage Council, there's the Assembly, which is for shifters, and then there's the Conclave, which is for elves. And so they all sort of work together to try not to kill each other. And so the overriding reason they all came together was they were under attack, and so the only way the world would survive was if they all joined forces. And so now they're having a sort of peaceful, I won't say it's an easy coexistence, but they're coexisting amongst themselves, and there's a whole framework of legal treaties and stuff to keep them from killing each other. Pretty much where we're at right now.
Nancy, I know that this is set in one of your larger universes, so let's find out about this given universe.
Okay. It's set in basically our contemporary world, but magic is real. There are ghouls that use dark magic, and they can suck magical energy or life force from their victims with talons that extend from their fingernails. And they are allied with demons from the void between worlds. And part of their goal, the ghouls' goal, as the story progresses, is to open a gate to let demons through to this world. And if that happens, we're pretty much all toast. So the mages are trying to prevent that from happening. And it's set in most of the story is set in southeastern Georgia. And some of the scenes, although by no means very many of them, take place in the Okefenokee Swamp as we go through the series.
Jean Marie?
Okay. Siren Bridge takes place in a secondary world which has reached the technological development of the Victorian era with magic. However, my story does not take place in an alternate London. I'm tired of steampunk happening in alternate London, and fantasies happening in gaslamp fantasies happening in alternate London. So I put it out west. And a lot of what you will see in Siren Bridge is sort of in the Missouri territory, in the period which we think of as the primary stomping ground of scallywags and riverboat gamblers and everything you saw on the original Maverick TV show, and you saw to a lesser extent on Wild Wild West. So you've got bustles, you've got great hats, you've got corsets, you've got magic, you've got people who are not any better than they should be.
So, Nancy, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper. Who are we hanging out with in this particular release, and kind of what are we walking into?
Well, the short description of the story is that the hero is looking for whoever helped ghouls murder his best friend, and the heroine is his prime suspect. He can't just go making accusations, though, because she is the chief deputy Shire Reeve, which makes her the chief deputy law enforcement officer in mage society in the Southeast. So he's trying to get his proof without having her figure out what he's up to and sick her buddies, either mages or ghouls, onto him. He runs a construction company in Atlanta. He's taken some time off and is working as a bartender in a town where a lot of the mages hang out and a lot of his prime suspects' friends hang out. And so he's hoping to kind of get close to them, see what he can learn. He doesn't have what I personally would call a really great plan of action, but it's the only one he's got, so he's going with it. He knows it's not the world's best plan, but he's hoping to improvise on the fly. She is the best friend of the heroine from Renegade Mage, and she's really deadly magical fighter, but the bane of her existence is that she's curvy. She's always been curvy. And guys look at her and they see curvy and they don't see a brain. And while she's not above using that to her advantage, it gets frustrating sometimes. She and the hero both like to play pool. And that's going to be one way to get them together. And they're also fans of Can You Stump Me? And so I'm having fun with that because I'm a trivia nerd from way back. And so that's giving me a lot of fun coming up with weird things for them to talk about and ask each other about. Pool, I don't know so much about, but I have a friend who plays, and there's the Google. So I'm hoping that'll all work out.
Jean Marie, tell us a little bit more about your group of scallywags and everybody else we're going to be hanging out with in Siren's Bridge. A story I've been waiting for since I heard a reading about 12 years ago.
Yeah, well, there is strudel involved. But the story focuses on Oleander Jones, a lady adventuress who is no better than she should be. But she knows all the rules of being a lady adventuress. Never involve yourselves in the affair of kings. Never, ever piss off a man with a private army. And whatever you do, do not confront a monster in its lair. Well, of course, this being my story, she has to do all three in short order. And the plot revolves around a very large, very beautiful, very valuable gem that Ollie is commissioned to steal. What she doesn't know is that stealing that gem puts a target on her back from two different sources, as well as this world's version of the Pinkertons. And then there's a siren and strudel.
All right, Andy.
I guess I should tell people what the title of the book is. That would probably help, right?
That might help.
So it's the second book in the series. There's a novella first, but it's called It Spells Trouble. And the two main characters, one's a griffin and the other is a mage. And essentially what happens is there's a bunch of kidnappings going on, children. And the chancellor of the Mage Council sends his, for lack of a better term, bastard son to go investigate. And he does it on purpose because the Griffin Alpha is a prick. Can I say that?
Sure.
Okay, I wasn't sure if that was, if that hit the wheel. And so he sends his son essentially because, you can't bully his son. And what he doesn't realize when he shows up is that the son of the Alpha is actually his mate. And they kind of dance around this, and they try and avoid it because the Alpha is going to try and corrupt his son and his mage because Yannick is the mage and he's very powerful. So this would be a real coup for the Griffin if they could control him. But of course, the Mage Council doesn't work with that. So there's a bit of a problem for them getting together, and a lot of the story revolves around trying to fix that. And then there's also the subplot of who's kidnapping the children, which they also have to figure out because, nobody wants to see kids kidnapped. So, but there's an overarching story to that, and really what ends up happening is they have to find a way to get around the father, get around the Alpha, and still be together. And then ultimately, it's this romance. They're trying really hard to get that without giving away too much. They figure it out somehow.
So I'm going to talk a little bit here as I approach my next question, which is one I haven't had an opportunity to use in this particular venue, but I'm going to entertain myself anyway. So we finally, after several years worth of angst, drama, and various publisher issues, we finally got out Fairy Films, which is over my shoulder, which is 12 essays which look at fairy folklore in films. Now, because I've never been known to do something the easy way, there's essays in it talking about things like Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, and there's things like looking at a number of different universes and different pieces there. But because I've never been one to do things the easy way, I made the proposal that the 1984 version of Dune was fairy folklore, and made a bet with the editor, who told me there was no way that could possibly be fairy folklore. So for a relatively short essay, my proposal was 1,800 words. And so that's why it wound up going in here. Because I'm the lucky one that wound up with a sci-fi piece in here. And having done a lot of panels at some conventions over the last couple of weeks, where we've talked a lot about folklore, specifically fairy folklore and magic, and how this influences fiction and the things that we play with. I'm going to throw a question out there, which is the idea of how do you use folklore? How does the influences of folklore, how do you decide what to pull and use of mythology, and folklore and legend and magic and all of that, and pulling story together? So, Jean Marie.
Well, it's basically the story. I mean, for this particular book, the initial request was to write a story that dealt with a mermaid or some variant thereof. But I don't do standard. I do comedy. And so when basically I thought immediately there has to be something that you can do with the siren, not specifically a mermaid, but sirens in popular conception are frequently seen as a variant of the mermaid myth. Instead of combing their lovely hair and singing, they do singing. Most of them are homely as well. I will keep it PG. They're very, very homely, but they have this voice. And you have, Odysseus, going back to the Greek myths. You've got Odysseus lashing himself to a pole so that he could hear this without jumping into an ocean and drowning. And so, being that that's the standard siren, my job was to make it as ridiculous as possible in this story. In the sequel, the whole thing is based on the fairy tale The Robber Bridegroom, but of course, it never quite works out as planned. Again, I write comedy, rinse, repeat.
So, Andy, how about you? How do you approach leveraging, pulling in folklore, myth, legend, and telling your stories?
I don't. I've kind of never been like, my first books were fantasy, and I created the world by myself, from my head. So there was no pulling somebody else's stories into it. So for this, I didn't really spend a lot of time looking at what other people or what folklore said they had to do. I made my own rules. And so if I did, if it came across something, if I knew something in the past, because I've studied mythology in the past, and I liked it, I would kind of work it in, but I didn't really try and make myself a slave to the mythologies or the ethos or the canon, so to speak, that have been created and handed down. So it's kind of like when, sparkly vampires, whoever heard of them, right? Well, yeah, that was how it went. And so there's no sparkly vampires. Let's just go with that. There's no sparkly anything in this. I just prefer to have, it's my world, it's my rules, it's my magical system. And so the myth and folklore are more like they inform, but they don't direct or they don't control. I think that's the best way. They inform, but that's about it.
Nancy?
Well, I don't use mythology in the series. I do use certain elements of folklore. When I first started to publish this series, which was originally published by someone else, I knew I needed a magic system. And I decided in a fit of organization to come up with it before I wrote anymore, instead of just doing it on the fly. So I read a lot of Wicca, a lot of candle magic, crystal magic, herbal magic, and herbal medicine and home remedies using plants. And then I combined some of those with crystals. And I got very interested in runes and the Norse culture around runes. So in Renegade Mage, it doesn't show up on the backdrop over my shoulder, but Griffin's staff is ash, and that's kind of traditional 7-foot ash staff. It's shot in silver, and it's incised with runes that are inlaid with copper. And there's a fair bit of folklore, folk wisdom around copper as a healing metal, but I just really honestly picked it because I think it's pretty, at least until it starts to turn green, and then that's a whole other thing. But I do use history and change certain events in history so that they actually involve magical forces that most of us don't know about. Like the arrival of the Black Death was occasioned by the opening of a demon portal in the Gobi Desert in, I think it was 1345. That's what brought the Black Death to Earth. Demons brought it. And so a lot of that is not laid out in the books because it doesn't need to be. When I reach the point where it will be, then it will pop up. There's a brief explanation. By brief, I mean like a page and a half, 2 pages, in Renegade Mage from the Geek Mage, Will, about the history of all this and how it relates to the problem they're having at present. Because as much as I love history, I don't really like it just dumped out there. If it's going to be included, what's included needs to be relevant to the problem that the characters are dealing with right now. So I have a whole lot of history for this world, but most of it has yet to.
Or my usual, one of the things that I always find interesting, because again, one of the most fun parts about being a writer, being a creator, is being able to trip over the research rabbit hole. And no matter what the project is, you're always going to learn something, discover something. Sometimes it's something in the research, something it's about the process. Sometimes it's just something you figure out about yourself when you're working on the project. So what's your one thing that, you kind of learned working on this particular project? And I'm going to throw that one out to everybody to figure out who goes first, because I'm going to be an agent of chaos.
I can go first, but it's not so much the research rabbit hole. the research was pretty straightforward. Go look at what people wore. Go look at, what the buildings were. I mean, basically, a large portion of my story takes place in a governor's mansion. Well, what were the hot governor's mansions of 1870 something? Where my favorite part of the research, however, was the fact that, remember when I said she was no better than she should be? Well, I remembered vaguely that there was a lady in Maverick, because I grew up watching the reruns of Maverick and watching Wild Wild West. And the best character in Wild Wild West was Miguelito Loveless. We'll just leave it at that. But for women, you had to go to the reruns of Maverick. And there was a lady called Samantha Crawford. And I spent an enormous amount of time watching Maverick to catch all the women who were no better than they should be. Now, for the romantic lead, I watched a lot of Sherlock Holmes featuring Robert Downey Jr. That was most fun.
All right, Andy, what'd you trip over in this one?
Civil War. So I set it up in Hagerstown, Maryland, which is a stone's throw from Antietam. And I've been there a couple times, and there are volumes written on the Civil War. And every battle has shelf, or more worth of books on in the library, and so I was trying to figure out where it was in relation to the city, and it really doesn't even come in the book. But I was looking up things in Hagerstown, although I've been there a few times, I'm not from there. And I started looking at Antietam, and then this one, and I was looking up different generals, and it was like, oh my gosh, and I went up the battle plans. And then from there, surprisingly, I ended up going to Fort DuPont in Washington, D.C., which is someplace I worked in D.C., so I was there quite a bit. And that was actually where the only time that D.C. was invaded. So I was like, on that. I was looking at the different forts and which ones are still there, where were they sited, and all that. So I went down the Civil War rabbit hole, which was a completely, utterly of no use to me in the story.
Nancy?
Pool. I went down the pool rabbit hole because I'd actually written pool in The King's Champion, which is World War II era, just came out. But that's pool played in Britain, and it's a different type of pool, and it's not 8-ball. So what I learned for that did me no good whatsoever. However, there are some 8-ball tournaments recorded on Google. There's like a pool association, and they have videos and a website. And the problem is, the part of the reason for using the pool is A, I haven't used it before and it's interesting, but B, it gives the characters something to do other than be talking heads. And so it lets the conversation slip along interspersed with action. Well, in order to write the action, I need to know how you play 8-ball. Do you have to call the shots before you take them? If you break and nothing goes in the pocket, is it your turn or is it the other person's turn? And I had to have answers for all of those things. And I enjoyed it more than I thought I would. It's sort of making me think, okay, who around here has a pool table? And I could drag my husband out there and make him play, just because now I've got this book coming out, novella, but still. And I want to put into practice all this stuff I've been learning. Not that I was ever any good at all at pool, but, I know the basics, and I can usually manage not to dig up the felt on the table. And so it'd be fun, but it was pool.
Well, it sounds like we've got plenty to stack up everybody's to-be-read piles with a little bit of mirth and magic and a dash of romance and adventure as well. But before we get out of here, let's make sure they will know where to find you guys and that latest release. So, Andy, you're up first.
So andygallo.com is my site. Obviously, Andy Gallo on Amazon. That's where you can find it. It comes out May 23rd, and it's only on Amazon right now, but it's in Kindle Unlimited, so you can get it there. Or you can find me on my Facebook group, which is gloriousreaders.com. Start with Gallo and then add glorious at the end.
Nancy?
You can find me at nancynorthcott.com. Probably more active than is good for me on Twitter, where I'm at Nancy Northcott, and that's my main social media site. I do have a street team on Facebook, which is just facebook.com/group/Nancy Northcott Street Team. Magic and Murder will be out the first week in June, and you can find it at all online vendors. And I guess since I didn't say this, and this is my last chance, it's a hidden agenda, enemies to lovers romance.
And Jean Marie?
Hey, well, you can find me at jeanmarieward.com. You can find me on Facebook at Jean Marie Ward Writer. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Jean_Marie_Ward. The book that I've been talking about most is Siren Bridge, and if you'll let me, I'll show you the cover.
All right. The big reveal?
And when I said the siren was homely, I meant the siren was homely. But there is another book that I will be having, and Siren Bridge will be available from Amazon and presumably most online vendors if you ask for it by name and my name, because I checked Amazon. There's nothing else with that title out there. But I have another story coming out set in a alternate version of 1421 China in the Zombies Need Brains anthology, Dragonesque, which is all about dragon stories from the dragon's point of view. And that can be found here. That's a dragon.
We're still seeing Siren Bridge.
Oh, no. How can that be? I'm seeing the right thing. Well, let me just change this. Okay. Okay. Are you seeing it now?
Nope.
No.
Okay. Well, how do we get it to be seen?
Send it to me and I'll cut it in here, and you're going to make me edit. But you can talk to it anyway.
Well, that's what I do. I make you edit. And so I will stop the share. So we are back to normal. And
so do you want to talk about the anthology a little bit?
Well, yeah. Siren Bridge is a Kickstarter anthology. Zombies Need Brains basically initiates all their anthologies with the Kickstarter campaign, and this is one of 4 this year to celebrate 10 years of Zombies Need Brains producing anthologies with both anchor authors and open submission. I was an anchor author for Dragonesque, which is, as I said, all about dragon stories from the dragon's point of view. And mine features my regular dragon character, Lord Bai, who tends to get into a lot of scrapes. There was one where he discovered the joys of pork, and then there was another where he met the Three Stooges in 1421 Nanjing. This one actually tells you what happens when you let a dragon loose in a government conference, something which I know way too much about.
Would anybody notice?
Actually, yes, when they basically bust through the windows, yeah. And somebody basically screams so loud that everybody, well, let us just say, among the older members of the conference, there is a regrettable loosing of the bladders. And it gets crazier from there.
Sounds like a book title to me, The Loosing of the Bladders.
Absolutely. That's going to be there somewhere. But yeah, again, you can find everything about me at jeanmarieward.com.
And I've had the pleasure of being your host, Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentialsworkshops.com, speculativefictionacademy.com, gradingpros.com, and here at ConTinual. And go stack up those to be read piles.